Okay, so the last set for this speciation section, part two, was talking about how species originate in different ways. We talked a little bit about the role of isolation. So one of the examples we talked about was geographic isolation, the role that geographic isolation plays in divergences over time. So the last thing that we're going to talk about here is reproductive isolation. So whenever you have any form of isolation, whether it's geographic isolation or mate recognition isolation or behavioral isolation, eventually what that's going to result in is genetically based barriers to gene flow. So once random mating ceases, you have a geographic barrier that arises and two populations are separated from each other. Eventually they're going to start to accumulate their own genetic differences because of selection, because of genetic drift, because of mutation, what have you. Eventually those populations are going to diverge genetically. So over time you're going to end up with genetically based barriers to gene flow. These are referred to as reproductive isolating mechanisms. Reproductive isolating mechanisms basically serve to keep two populations separate if they ever come back into contact with each other again. So if the river dries up or whatever geographic barrier that's been separating the two populations disappears, then what happens? Do those two descendant populations have the ability to interbreed with each other anymore, or are they distinct from each other? So uh, we have two broad categories here of reproductive isolation, and both are genetically controlled. So we have prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms and postzygotic. A zygote is basically the fertilized egg. So if we're talking about prezygotic mechanisms, we're talking about things that prevent a fertilization event from happening. Postzygotic means things that happen to the offspring after the zygote is formed. So we'll get to some examples of that momentarily. Okay, so let's talk about some prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanisms. You can have several different categories here listed on the slide. The first, temporal or habitat isolation. Basically, this is what happens when groups live in different habitats. So there are actual physical barriers that are separating the individuals from each group. You can have, you know, some kind of habitat isolation involving differences in times of sexual maturity, for example. So it's just anything that's happening within a habitat that is preventing males and females from different groups from interbreeding with each other. Sexual isolation by behavior or conduct is basically kind of, we already covered an example of this, reproductive isolation in the form of mating call rituals. So if you have different mating calls, population A and population B have different mating calls. Males from population A are not going to know when males or females of population B are receptive to sexual behavior. So differences in mating rituals or courtship rituals basically can interfere with mate recognition. Mechanical isolation would be when genitalia are not physically compatible with each other. This is something that's actually fairly common in insects. Insect genitalia tends to be really complex. It's like sort of like a lock and key sort of mechanism. So if you have mechanical isolation, it literally means that the male genitalia and the female genitalia are not compatible with each other from two different groups. So if you don't have compatible genitalia, you're never going to get to the point of a fertilization event occurring. Gametic isolation means basically that the two gametes are not compatible with each other. So the sperm and the egg may come together. So let's say there is no habitat isolation, there's no sexual isolation by behavior, the genitalia fit together just fine. The gametes might still be incompatible with each other. So the sperm and the egg come together, but the egg can't be fertilized by the sperm. An example of this would be like the sperm of one fish not being able to penetrate the eggs of another type of fish. The other type, post-zygotic mechanisms, these are things that happen again after a fertilization event has occurred. So in this scenario, none of these factors apply. There's no habitat isolation, there's no sexual isolation. The genitalia fit together, the gametes are compatible, but you can still have problems arise. So you can have something called zygote mortality. Basically, this means that the fertilized zygote dies, it's not viable. Non-viability of hybrids also counts here. Basically, what non-viability means is that you might have a fertilization event, but the embryo or the fetus doesn't grow and develop in a normal way, so it's non-viable. The last one here, hybrid sterility, you can have a hybrid form, so you have gametic compatibility, the zygote survives, the zygote is viable. You can still have a situation where a hybrid makes it to adulthood, but that hybrid itself is sterile. So the hybrid is capable of normal growth and development, but it's unable to reproduce. So an example of this that you're probably all familiar with would be a mule, which is the cross between a horse and a donkey. They're genetically similar enough to be able to produce an offspring, but the mule is actually sterile. Another example on the slide here is a hybrid cross of a male zebra and a female donkey. So this is something called a zonkey, also sometimes called a zebroid. You can see that the hybrid offspring has characteristics of both parent species. So this animal here, this little guy, looks a lot like a donkey, but he has the striping pattern on his legs that shows his zebra ancestry as well. So hybrid sterility is something that's really common in nature. Another example that some of you might be familiar with is the liger. A liger is a hybrid of a male lion and a female tiger. Lions and tigers are members of the same genus, the genus Panthera, but they are different species. So ligers exist only in captivity because their ranges in nature, of course, don't overlap. African lions and Asian tigers are not going to meet each other in nature. But in captivity, they can hybridize and produce sterile offspring. So ligers have characteristics of each parent, behavioral and physical. So they like to swim, which is a tiger-like characteristic, but they're also highly sociable, which is a lion characteristic. And as you'll note here by looking at the picture, ligers grow much larger than either parent species, and this is something that's true of a lot of hybrids. It's something called hybrid vigor. Hybrid vigor is basically when a sterile hybrid is very robust, meaning it's large or it's strong, what have you. Mules are used as pack animals because they display hybrid vigor. They're very strong, they have a lot of endurance, they're much stronger than either a horse or a donkey. So this is something that we see a lot of in nature. Hybrid vigor is something that is probably the result of basically a healthy reproductive system not being maintained. So these animals are sterile. So the theory is they have sort of extra energy that's not being devoted to maintaining a functioning reproductive system. So it kind of gets rediverted in terms of size and strength.